finishing up Japan. I don't really have that much to cover today. We're just wrapping up sort of the modern era. So where we were last time was we were talking about this last period, or this almost last period, the last shogunate, the Edo period under the Tokugawa. And one of the things I talked about was this development of this new merchant class, or sort of middle class. And the Ogata brothers were an example of that. They ran a business. They weren't really, they're part of that Rimpa style, which is a decorative style. And it was sort of a crossover between interior design and fine art. So they weren't really thought of as sort of fine artists in the same way. They really did run a shop, and it really was more interior design. And as a family, they were part of this new merchant class, this new middle class associated with the city of Edo, which is Tokyo. And I also talked about the fact that that was a growing city, urbanization, a lot of changes happening in that city. And I want to talk more about that, the change in culture and how that changed art. It changed the nature of the audience for art, and it changed what people wanted. And that is leading me into a discussion of printmaking, and particularly the Japanese color woodblock print. But I want to talk about prints. Some of you are familiar with prints if you had the Western course, because we talked about the development of printmaking in the West. But I want to talk a bit about printmaking in general before we move on, because it's an important part of the art world, particularly in the modern era, but even before then. First of all, we misuse the term print today all the time. We refer to things as prints when they're not prints. They're posters or they're reproductions of something. That's not what we mean by a print. A print is a specific image or object made in a particular way. The definition I'm using here is when you ink or carve a surface and then put either sort of ink or paint on it and then press it against something else, you're making a print. That is created by an object being pressed against another object. And of course, you know, you think of like a rubber stamp, or you ink something and stamp it. That is an example of a print. Prints can be copies of things, or they can be original images. And they're one of the most ancient media for making art. I mean, prints aren't new. If you rub your hand with some kind of pigment and stamp it on the wall of a cave, you've made a print. So prints are ancient. They've always been with us. People have always created images in that way, some two-dimensional and three-dimensional. When you make a rubbing from something, you're transferring an image from one material to another material. Cylinder seals that we looked at in the ancient world are prints. You're carving in stone, and then you press that on clay, and you're making an image. That's considered a print. Chinese were the first to really begin taking that and using it more broadly. They began printing on fabric as early as 200. And of course, we think of beautiful fabrics and silks from the East, but this is where prints began to be used, you know, hand printed fabrics, and then on paper by 700. Now, printing is also, you know, we can talk about images, but, you know, text is also printed. It's the same thing. Printing presses originated in China in the late 9th century. And really this is long before in Europe. You know, every time I hear somebody talk about the printing press being invented in the 15th century and the Gutenberg Bible being the first printed book, I want to scream because that's totally not true. The oldest printed book that we know about, because there could be some we haven't found, but they date to the 9th century, and they're Chinese. The Chinese had printing presses 500 years or more before Europe had printing presses. Movable type also appears. This is where it's like 500 years earlier. Fine art prints are different from copying. Until photography, until around 1838 or 39, when photography begins, the only way you could duplicate an image, if you want to say, oh, here's a beautiful painting, I want a copy of it or an image of it, you would have to have someone make a print of it. They would make a black and white print, and I'll talk more about how these are made in a minute. So if you go somewhere and look at a 19th century book that's maybe a book on travelogues of places in the world, they're going to be full of prints. So these are handmade engravings, really, that are put into books. But so copying was one early use of prints, but you could also, using the same technique, create original images and original works of art. And that began in the West in the 15th century. And if you remember, we looked at people like Albrecht Dürer was one of the earliest printmakers in Germany in the late 15th, early 16th century, and others. They were made as fine art by the 15th century and on. One of the ways that a print differs from a painting, for example, is prints are not one of a kind. You can make multiple prints from the same image, and also they're on paper. They're from very early on, they're recognized as being less elitist than other art media. I mean, let's face it, paintings are one-of-a-kind objects. They were very expensive, and they were really, at least historically, something that was only available to the very wealthy who could afford to go hire an artist and paint them a picture. It's very elitist. It wasn't for the masses. But many people began recognizing, especially by the 19th century in the West, that there was something more egalitarian about a print. It's cheap, it's much, much cheaper. It can be mass produced in large numbers, and therefore it was seen as an art form for the masses. And particularly in the 19th century, with the rise of socialist ideals in Europe, many artists embraced prints because they were socialists, or they were embracing the idea of socialism and art for the working class or middle class at the very least. So let's look at what we're actually talking about here in terms of prints, what they are. There are many, many different types of prints. Prints that generally in the West were black and white. They usually made using ink, ink on paper, so they were black and white. We'll talk about the development of color prints because that's going to happen in Japan. That's where we're going to start there. But the prints as we know them today are several types, and it depends on what is the positive and what is the negative space. Here's an example of the oldest type of print, which is a relief print. Now, relief means raised from the surface. Remember, we've talked about relief sculpture when we were looking at Western art and early art in Asia. That's basically when you have something carved on a flat wall or a flat surface. It's sculpture, but it's called relief sculpture. It's three-dimensional. So a relief print is when the raised area is what prints. Here's an example of someone who's carved a wooden block. The most common types of relief prints are woodcuts. And that's what we're going to be seeing in Japan as well. But that was also the most common type in the West. You could also use linoleum, lino cuts. It's this, a regular printing press or letter press is a relief print. A rubber stamp, when you stamp it on ink, that's a relief print because it's the raised area that is inked. So if you're making a woodcut, here's what you would do. You basically carve away or remove the negative space. You cut away the background. right? So you can see in this carving, this person is carving away the background and leaving the areas they want to be black, black lines or black surfaces, leave those raised. Now, because you're actually carving away the negative space, carving a woodcut is actually counterintuitive. It's the reverse of the way you would normally think if you were an artist. Let's say, for example, you're making an ink drawing where you've got a pen here and a piece of paper and you start making marks on it. The marks you make are going to be the positive space. In other words, you would draw what you want the person to see as the form, and you would not draw on the background or the open or negative space. So that your hand makes a mark to create the positive image. But when you're doing a woodcut and you're using a cutting tool like this, the marks your hand is making is not the positive space, it's the negative space. So you have to think backwards. You're going to mark everything except what you want to actually see, which is why a lot of artists, traditionally in the West anyway, often hired someone to cut their wooden block for them, an actual carver, a wood carver, who was a specialist in doing this, because it is hard for an artist to reverse their thinking in this way. So the artist would maybe make a drawing and then give that drawing to a carver. And we're going to see how that process plays out in Japan. So then, once you've cut the image and remove the background, then you want to ink the raised surface. So you usually use a roller, a large roller, a roller, in fact, that's wider than the wooden block, because you need it to be parallel so that when you put ink on it and roll it across the surface, it only touches the raised areas, right? You don't want the ink to touch in the areas below. In this particular cut, this artist wanted these sort of black marks on the background, so they've left those areas raised. Okay, so now we've got the wooden block and we've inked it so the raised areas have ink on them. Now, how do you print it? Well, quite simply, you lay a sheet of paper over the top carefully, and then using another roller, one that's clean, you roll over it or press it down. And then when you lift the paper up, you have the image. And you can see here in this relief print, this is the ink. So the ink is sitting on the raised areas where the cutout areas here have no ink on them. So that's the relief process. The other type, principal type of print is just the opposite of that. It's a reverse of that. The negative and positive spaces are reversed, and those are called intaglio prints. Intaglio is simply Italian for cut or to cut. And this is the type of print that became popular in the West. Early on in the 15th century, some artists experimented with woodcut, but woodcuts are very hard to make fine detail because the wood is simply too soft. You can't cut really, really narrow, thin lines raised in wood because it'll just bend or break. You can maybe print one sheet of paper on it and then it will be no good for use anymore. I forgot to make the point of the fact that once you've printed it, you can simply ink it again and print it again, ink it again and print it again. And so you might have 20 identical images from the same wood block. That's why they're cheaper, because you can make multiples from one carving. You can make multiple works of art. The problem is fine detail. You can't get many prints out of wood simply because it's too soft. You need a harder surface. So this is when they began working with copper plates. And it's not a relief process, it's an intaglio process. In other words, you remove the positive space rather than the negative space. So in this case, the cut or mark you make is exactly what it would be if you had an ink pen in your hand and you were making a mark. So it's exactly the way an artist would make the image, because that's what's going to be black when we ink it, because it's a reverse process. The two principal types of intaglio, and there are many, but the two principal ones are engraving and etching. And they're not the same process at all. They're very specific. Engraving is older. Engravings began to be made in the West in the 15th century, or 15th and no, let's make it 16th century. Yeah, it really was 16th, early 16th century. And etching comes along in the 17th century. There's no evidence that engravings or etchings were made in the East. In the East, they're going to embrace the relief process that we talked about a moment ago. Wood cuts are going to dominate. But in the West, these become very popular. Engravings is a technique where you quite simply just with a sharp tool cut into the copper plate. And the nature of the tool and the medium is such that you pretty much have to make almost straight lines. You can do some curves, but by and large, you do straight lines, hatching and cross hatching. And that's what you see down here. Straight lines makes hatching. When you cross those straight lines, it's cross hatching. And that's how you create variant shades of grays, depending on how close you put them together. It's really all black, white, but depending on how close the lines are, it can look as if it's gray, a light gray or a dark gray. I'll show you some actual images in just a moment. Etching, on the other hand, is a very, very different process. And you're not really cutting into the plate with an etching. It's a more complicated process. You're covering the surface with a resist material, some sort of material that is resistant to acid. And I say that because the etching plate is going to go in acid. It's acid that's going to burn into the copper plate. You don't scratch into it. So when you cover this surface with a resist material, you don't use a sharp cutting tool, you use a finer tool closer to a needle. And the marks that are being made here are not cutting into the plate, they're exposing the plate. They're scratching off or removing that resinous surface that would protect it from the acid, so that when it's put in acid, the acid will burn wherever those marks are. Now the acid will cut into the plate. So it's a different process. It's a technique that allows greater contrast and variation in line. And so it was actually a much more appropriate to the styles of the 17th century. Now, both of them are printed in the same way. Once the plate is cut, then there's really no difference between how you print an engraving or how you print an etching. I do want to say I hear these words misused constantly, often by people who should know better. They're always referring to something as an etching when it's not. Unless acid is being used, it's not an etching. So you've probably heard of things like etched glass, etc. That's correct, because acid is used to cut into glass. It's a technique in which acid is used. So if you're not using acid, it can't be an etching. It's probably an engraving. So you print them. You've got the plate now, the copper plate. Now in this case, the ink is, you want the ink in the recessed area because that's your positive space. That's what you either cut away or had acid bite away. So what you do is you put ink all over the plate, and then you wipe the surface clean so that the ink remains or pools in these little recessed areas. That's what you want. Now you put the sheet of paper over it, but because the ink is recessed in these little pools, you need a slightly different process to get it to contact the paper. Before we move on, I'm showing you an etching by Rembrandt. He is one of the artists in the 17th century who really worked in etching and elevated that to a fine art realm. And it's a very dramatic image, big pools of dark and light and swirling lines. This is what you can do with an etching that really you couldn't do a century earlier with an engraving, but it was all right because they didn't want to do that in the 16th century. It was a different style in the Renaissance. This is now the Baroque, and they want this more emotional style. To print, you're going to need a press. You don't need a press if you're making a relief cut. Because all you need to do is lay the paper over the wood, because it's the raised area has the ink. The minute you lay the paper down, it's contacting the ink, but not so with an intaglio. So you need something that's going to press the paper down just far enough to contact that ink. You want to press it down so that it reaches this. So you could have a small tabletop press or a larger, studio press like this, but the purpose is the same thing. You put the copper plate down, have it all inked and wiped, paper on top, and then you run it through the press, which presses down and picks up the ink. Now let's talk about how all this relates to what happens in Japan. The Japanese develop a process, well, they take the process to a new level. Color woodblock printing began in China, but China used only ink. They didn't do color. Now that shouldn't surprise us, because Chinese painting in general use very little color. There are very few periods where color played much of a role in Chinese painting. So of course it's not going to play much of a role in Chinese printmaking, where we know in Japan, color always played an important role in Japanese painting, except for those periods where they were influenced by China, right? Those periods where they were trying to be Chinese, then of course they didn't make color, but they're interested in color. So they're going to develop a color woodblock print. Now, color printing, color printmaking doesn't develop in the West until the 1890s, much, much later, and largely under the influence of Japanese prints, which, as we'll see in a little bit, enter Europe in large numbers in the 19th century. And 19th century printmakers are going to try and figure out their own way to make color prints. Its popularity in Japan is very important as it relates to the rise of the middle class, because they're going to want, number one, something they can afford, something that's not sort of as elitist as these expensive one-of-a-kind hanging scrolls or, folding screens or whatever. But they're also going to want something that is less attached to these traditional classic subjects and more attached to subjects from their own world. If there's one way that I see a clear relationship between East and West as we enter into a modern era, which in both places is generally somewhere between the 18th and 19th century is where we begin to see, quote, a modern world. In both cases, we see middle class, but we also see the desire for new subjects in art, the desire for subjects that reflect their world and their experience, not so much the elitist subjects of earlier periods. And it's absolutely true in Europe, and it's absolutely true in Japan. Not so much China. China's history is different. Japan is fairly early on a path to Westernization. And so their development, cultural development, is closer to ours in the West. So we'll talk more about the subjects, but this is a good example of the new kinds of subjects. I want to point out some characteristics, stylistic characteristics of this piece, and then I want to look at how they're made, because most of the stylistic characteristics come from the process of making, and it's a totally new process. And then we'll come back and talk about the subject. One of the things we see in Japanese prints is flatness. Everything here is completely flat. There is no modeling of form, no subtle shading, nothing attempting to create the illusion of 3 dimensions. And that is enhanced by the black outlines. Everything is outlined in black. That will always flatten the form. It will make it look flat. First thing you learn in drawing class, don't draw outlines around things, partially because nothing in the natural world actually has a black outline around it, and partially because it will flatten your form. If you're trying to make it look rounded or 3-dimensional, that will destroy the illusion. The other characteristic we see is the use of patterns. Beautiful patterns juxtaposed to other patterns. So it's pattern on pattern. And this really comes from, Japanese fabric design, which is also printed. It's not a coincidence that a beautiful woodblock print of a woman in this beautiful kimono is going to have the same kind of beautiful pattern fabric that was also printed by woodcuts when the fabric was made. So there is a relationship here between fabric design and many of the artists like the Ogata brothers, whose work we just saw, actually were fabric designers as well. So the design of fabric is part of the sort of key Japanese aesthetic. So let's talk about how color woodblock prints are made. Fortunately, we have this wonderful triptych or three-part color woodblock print grouping that shows a group of women making color woodblock prints. Now, color woodblock prints in Japan is a collaborative process. No one person makes these. It starts with an artist who makes a drawing, and the artist will make an ink, black and white ink drawing, line drawing. And sometimes they will mark certain colors that they want. They might mark that on the drawing, but then that's all they do. Then they pass that drawing off to professional carvers. And that's what you see happening in this panel on the right. What they're doing is preparing, and here's the wood blocks. So the first thing they're going to do is carve what's called the key block. And the key block is a single block of wood with everything cut away except the outlines, the black outlines around everything. That's all that's going to be raised on that surface are black outlines. That's why it's called the key block. It's key. It identifies all the areas, all the parts, as if you just did a drawing of outlines. And then they're going to mark on that block certain registration marks, and printmakers still do this. You mark on the block with a little cut of some kind a specific spot. It helps you line the paper up when you're lining it up to print. So now the key block is made, you set that aside, and now one additional block is carved for each color in the print. Let's say, let me back this up so we can look at this print for a second. Let's say there are 5 colors here or 6 colors here. Then you would cut one block in which everything is removed except where this color is. Let's say this sort of maroon color. There is a block was made to print this one color only. And on that block, everything else is carved away and removed except one shape, the shape of that color, nothing else. And one block for this color, one block for the yellow, one block for this, no matter where they are on the image. So the block in which this yellow form is left raised, on that same block, you would have this yellow, wherever you want that color is left raised. So then you might end up with 6 or 7 or 8, depending on the colors, one for each color plus the key block. Now that's it. Now the carver hands it off to the printer. So here you see them carving blocks. And now someone over here is in charge of the colors, the color dyes, and now they're getting ready to print them. So the first thing you do is you print the key block. You take a sheet of paper with the key block and you put black. Remember, the outlines are all black. All these black outlines were printed from the key block. Every one of the black outlines was printed from that block. It's all inked. Now you lay a sheet of paper over and line it up with those registration marks, lay it down, rub it, lift it off carefully, and there's your black outline. Now I want to print the blue. So I take the block that has the raised area that will be, say, well, we don't have blue. Let's say this maroon color. I want to print that next. So I'll take the block where that's the raised area, and I'll take that same sheet of paper and line it up carefully on that block and lay it down and then print that color and lift it off. And then you do that with each color. So each sheet of paper is going to be printed 7, 8, 9 times, depending on how many colors there are. This is labor intensive. And they made these in the hundreds of thousands. I mean, not from one block, but they would make many, many multiples. And as soon as you went through the whole process on one sheet of paper, then you start over again on another sheet of paper. And you print the key block, and then you print each color one at a time. And then you start with another. These were everywhere in Japan. And because there were so many, they were relatively inexpensive. So you see the process. These are the papers hanging up to dry once they're all printed. So that process tells us why this image looks the way this image looks, why it's flat, because you don't really have the ability to create gradations of a shade. You know, this is going to be all the same color everywhere in this space. It's a print. We don't have the ability at this point in time to make this sort of a darker color here and a lighter color here. It's all flat color. The patterning comes from where the key block is cut. I mean, some of these details are quite incredible, but it comes from the cutting of the wood, not from the printing of the color. So depending on how detailed and complicated the wood cutting is, that's where you get pattern. And some of it is very, very difficult indeed. So what we're looking at here is called nishiki-e. That's the technique I just described. Nishiki-e literally means, literally nishiki means brocade. So an e at the end means picture. Remember, we came on that before. So nishiki-e means brocade picture. And they call it that because of these patterns and textures. And it does sort of remind you of brocade. I mean, brocade is a complex fabric design that has a lot of different patterns and richness. It isn't really brocade, but you can see why it's called that. So nishiki-e is the technique of color wood block print. In this particular one, it's also ukiyo-e. Ukiyo-e refers to the subject matter, where nishiki-e refers to the technique in which it's made. Ukiyo-e does refer to prints. So all ukiyo-e are nishiki-e, but not all nishiki-e are ukiyo-e. We're going to look at some landscape color wood block prints. Ukiyo-e literally means the floating world, or picture of the floating world. And what they meant by floating world was the sort of world of the sort of ephemeral world of entertainers and others in the public eye in the entertainment districts of Tokyo. It's somewhat hard to explain, but at the same time, it's somewhat not, because we still have the same fascination with some people. Celebrity, you know, it's the world of celebrity. These are often depictions of famous courtesans or beautiful women or actors or actresses. You know, if you pick up a People magazine and there's some actor on the cover, it's exactly the same thing. They were as fascinated by this world. That's why they called it the floating world. It's a sort of ephemeral world that you're not part of, but you want to peek into that world. There's something attractive about it. It's in Europe, they called it the demi-monde, or the people sort of outside of the reputable world. So it's entertainers. It's a phenomenon that's part of urbanization in the new city, and Tokyo had all these entertainment districts and all these sort of this sort of new world that kind of didn't exist in the past, and that's what they're interested in. So Utamaro did a series, and they're almost all in series, so there'll be multiple prints and multiple editions of each print. When you make more than one print, identical print, it's called an edition. So maybe you'll make an edition of 20, which means there are 20 identical prints. So you would have a series of maybe 10 images, but then an edition of 20 of each of those. So now you're talking 200 prints already. So that's sort of how prints are constructed. In this, the theme of the series was the 10 physiognomic types of women. This is basically saying, giving qualities to women and identifying them. This is called the coquettish type. I'll show you some others from the series in a moment. Now let's look at this. First of all, I think this is such a beautiful print. I absolutely love these. I love the colors. I love patterns. I'm particularly attracted to pattern on pattern on pattern. Anyway, it's something that in my own sewing, I'm really interested in the idea of. They're filled with subtle gestures, expressions, nods, hand positions that all seem to identify to the viewer a personality characteristic, because that's what they mean by physiognomic types of women. We can't read them. When I look at them, and here are 4 more from that series, and I wouldn't even attempt to judge some personality characteristic here because I don't see it. Although possibly in this one, the way her head is turned really quickly and the way her eyebrows are, perhaps she's suggesting envy or jealousy. I don't know. That's close as I can get to guessing, but I guarantee that the Japanese would understand it and could read them because there's a long history of that. Remember when we were looking at the scroll of Genji and I talked about the little subtle variations of color or movement or position of the head, which would be easily read by someone within the culture, and they would understand what was going on or what was meant to be said. You know, it's harder for us to read them, but it's really a beautiful series of prints. And I particularly love the patterns and colors, and the complexity of carving these is beyond me. To me, that's the real art form, is carving these. Anybody can do a simple line drawing, but to turn that into an actual print with this much detail using something as soft as wood, which is very hard to work with, is to me mind-boggling. Udamara also did this beautiful series. Some of them are sort of sensual to the point of being openly erotic. It's not sort of pornography. It's definitely meant to be eroticism, but it's done in such a beautiful, elegant way. And this one, it's from a series called Poem of the Pillow, which is a series of erotic prints. But you know, there's something sort of dizzying about the pattern on pattern. It just seems to work perfectly. I think this is a beautiful print. And the most erotic part of this print, if you're familiar with Japanese culture, you may recognize the fact that it's the back of her neck that is considered the most erotic element in this scene. The back, particularly if it's sort of low cut, this is the Japanese equivalent to a sort of low cut dress. In the West, it would be cut low in the front, and you would see, you know, décolletage. Well, in Japan, it's cut low in the back, and you see this exposed neck because that was considered very erotic. If you look at kimonos, especially some of the older traditional kimonos that a geisha would wear, you know, they're cut somewhat low in the back and the collar sort of sticks out a bit. That was meant to be a sort of risque in many ways. Beautiful print. I love Udamaro, but he's an 18th century artist. He's very early, and this is some of the earliest. They began entering Europe, not just Udamaros, but many, many more, began to enter Europe in large numbers in the 1860s and 70s. And it's interesting because of how they got there. By the 18th, we'll talk more about the history of Japan and what happens in Japan in the 1850s, which opens Japan to the West. There's a very important event that happens in the 1850s. And from then on, Japan is completely open to Europe and the Americas for trade and everything else. And that's when the Japanese began exporting, particularly ceramics, to Europe in large numbers. But the ceramics they're exporting are not Japanese ceramics. You know, Europeans didn't want raku, you know, those beautiful handmade sort of rough peasant style Japanese vessels. That's not what Europeans wanted. Europeans wanted those beautiful, elegant Chinese vases, you know, that blue and white ware that we saw with dragons and the like. That's what Europeans want. So, and also the more colorful ones from later China. So the Japanese learned how to make those, and the Japanese started making Chinese pottery. They started making Chinese style pots and exporting them to Europe in large numbers. The Japanese were very industrious. As soon as they were forced to open to the West, they learned how to use that and exploit that, and had a great reputation for that. In fact, if you're looking for, you used to be able to go to thrift stores and look for these sort of Chinese looking vessels. If you found one that said made in Japan on the bottom, a Chinese vase that said made in Japan, those at a certain point began to be worth a lot of money, and because they stopped doing that. So they're sort of pre-World War II. Anyway, what they did when they exported is they wrapped them in whatever paper they had laying around, and they had hundreds of thousands of these prints lying around. They were worth pennies. There were so many. And so they would grab sheets of these prints and they just used them as wrapping paper. They would just wrap the pots in them and ship them off to Europe. And Europeans started unwrapping their Chinese vessels and opening them up and seeing these prints. And they loved the prints. They would lay them out and see these beautiful prints. And they started saying, stop sending the pots, send prints. So they started sending Japanese prints to Europe, and they were so cheap in Europe that even dirt poor artists could afford prints. Every artist in the 1870s, by the 1870s and 80s, had Japanese prints tacked up all over their walls. In fact, if you see photographs of artist studios from the time period, you will often see Japanese prints just tacked up on the wall. And of course, they're going to have an influence, partially because Europeans were already moving in that direction. They were already moving away from, especially by the 90s, they were moving away from extreme naturalism into more expressive art or more stylized art. And so the flatness appealed to them, the pattern appealed to them. I mean, this is an interesting subject that we can deal with in some other context later if you want to, but I just wanted to show you a few things. Mary Cassatt was certainly one of the artists who was very influenced by Japanese prints. You see it really obviously in some. These are actually prints that she made. She was also a printmaker. And it's in the 1890s that Europeans learned how to make color prints for the first time. These are not woodcuts, however. These are lithographs, which is a different kind of print that I don't really want to get into now. It's outside the context of what we're talking about. But you see the flat, there's no modeling. It's pattern on pattern. Everything here is clearly Japanese. The sense of space here, again, the flatness of the forms, the importance of the pattern and shaping the space, all show a Japanese influence. You see it particularly in the post-impressionist, when it's perhaps not as obvious. Someone like Gauguin, you see it in his works from the 90s on, the black outlines around things, the sort of flat colors, the patterns. Gauguin in particular was always interested in pattern. He really is the father of the sort of pattern and decoration school of the 20th century. Here, where you see flat patterning everywhere, that's influenced by Japanese prints. It's a subtle thing that's being absorbed. Certainly in paintings like this. Now here's one of his most famous paintings from 88, Vision After the Sermon, as Jacob wrestling with the angel. But the use of a tree like this in the foreground that sort of cuts across and separates the space. Hiroshige used it in this print. We know he knew this print. In fact, he probably personally had a copy of this print, but it's in a lot of other Japanese prints. You see that here as the tree cuts across. Again, the flat color used in a somewhat abstract way, the simplification of the forms. And there's a lot more going on here. There's a lot of other reasons it looks this way, but you are seeing this absorption of Japanese Japanese prints. And of course, Van Gogh owned several, and he was dirt poor. He couldn't even afford to buy food, but he had Japanese prints. That's how cheap they were. Here he's literally copying. He did a lot of his own interpretations. This is a Hiroshige print, and we'll look at Hiroshige in a minute, but this is his copy from it. It's not identical because he's Van Gogh, and it's going to be more expressive, and you're going to see the paint surface, but it's still an interest in a sort of design sensibility and an aesthetic that he's interested in. He also had and knew this Hiroshige print, where he's literally making his own interpretation of it here. With everything's intensified more, of course. It's not going to be flat and smooth the way a print would be, because it's an oil painting. It's not a print, but nonetheless, his interest is there. But I think more importantly, to me, the more profound influences are not the ones where it's obviously copying something Japanese, but the way they've absorbed an aesthetic. And a perfect example of that is the irises that he did. It's one of his most famous pieces. He actually has several versions of it. But I remind you of the Ogata Koren screens we looked at before, where I talked about how instead of seeing this field and river and bridge from a distance, he puts us right in the middle of it. And that's what Van Gogh is doing here. He's literally sitting us down in the middle of this field of irises, and we're experiencing it in a way that is very reminiscent of a Japanese aesthetic. It's nothing like a Western way of looking at a garden. It's an Eastern way of looking at a garden, or a Japanese way. And those are the subtle ways, and in many ways the most important ways in which we see the influence of Japanese prints in the West. One of the most famous images that we have, that we know, and everybody knows this print. Most people are familiar with this print, the Hokusai, which is also one from a series of 36 views of Mount Fuji, but this is the most famous one. Hokusai had, he's working in the 19th century, quite a bit later. He was the best known in the West then, and certainly now. He originally started as an ukiyo artist, in other words, depicting subjects from sort of popular culture, like actors and the like. But then he's moved on to other subjects, and later really helped usher in a new popularity for landscape in printmaking. So it's color wood block print. There's a million things to say. I once saw an hour-long documentary on this one image. It's complicated enough in its meaning that you could do an hour on it. But I don't even remember most of that, so we won't bother with all of that. But clearly, it's about endurance. You've got the two boats down here in the sea that seems like it will devour them. Mount Fuji is not only a symbol of the imperial family, it's a symbol of immortality, and that seems to speak to what's happening here. People talk about the waves that come up and the sort of fingers on the waves. It is a beautiful design. It's also 19th century, it's later, and they've actually advanced the technique to where they're able to get more subtlety in the colors. It's not so much all hard edge. So you don't see a black outline here. You see a kind of much more subtle range of grays. They found, developed new techniques for laying down the dye so that they can get greater subtlety and not just all completely flat outline forms. What people are talking about right now, really not right now, it's been for the last 20 years. They've talked about this in the context of fractals, because I don't know if you're familiar with fractals or how much you know about fractals, but people have been obsessed with fractals ever since the chaos theory started being talked about in the popular press in the 90s. But they're a certain kind of pattern that exists in nature, but it's a self-replicating pattern. It's an infinite pattern in which the forms repeat themselves on different scales. So this image down here on the lower left is the one I've seen more often, but you could magnify this and it would look identical to this, and then magnify the tiniest thing in that and it would still be identical to that. So now no matter what scale you're looking at this image, it's going to be identical. They're called fractals, and it's a mathematical construct that people have found in nature. This is, if you don't recognize this, I'm trying to remember the name of it. God, what's it called? It's a kind of broccoli, actually. It's a vegetable, and I can't remember what the name of it is, but you see it in fern leaves. You know, he obviously doesn't know the mathematics of fractals, but he's observed a phenomenon in nature. And so, you know, watch for fractals when you see them. They're really interesting forms. My favorite printmaker, and he's later as well, my favorite of the Japanese printmakers is Hiroshige, Ando Hiroshige, who did a series. This is from his 53 Stations of the Tokaido Highway from 1833. And in fact, the subtleties are even greater here. It's what I really love about this. He's definitely the most famous printmaker of the Edo period. He published the whole set of these in 1834, and he became a landscape specialist. These are basically travelogue prints. They were inspired by a trip that he made from Edo or Tokyo to Kyoto in 1832 with a convoy who was escorting a group of horses that were being brought to the emperor, a gift from the shogun, who's, remember, in Edo, a gift to the emperor who's in Kyoto. And so he accompanied them along this highway that ran all along the southern shore of the island of Honshu. And that highway is the Tokaido Highway. And he sort of like a travelogue, you know, he documents each place and how each one is unique. He was really inspired by the views that he saw, the countryside, and also he places them in different seasons. He makes sure that in each print, he has something that's very regional, so you'd recognize the region. This is at the Kambara station. It's one particular station. And, you know, the architecture identifies, but also the clothing of the people. He'll put something in it, so it's sort of a regional variation. There are also, by this time, new dyes that were available. They have a lot of new dyes that they didn't have before. And I think that may be responsible for some of these subtleties. Again, these subtle grays in here that you see, maybe because of the new dye. So it's not so much about color. It's still somewhat about pattern, but not really the same. So really a beautiful series of works by Hiroshige. Here's another one that's more colorful. This is the Otsu station. So it's really, again, very different because it's a different place, and he's giving us a sort of different season. Beautiful example of the use of a color wood block print. These are the kind of subjects that are popular. I find it interesting that the rise of popularity of landscape, East and West, goes hand in hand with the rise of the middle class. Landscape, as well as printmaking, is a middle class art. Anyone can understand and appreciate a landscape. It speaks about your world. It's not an elitist subject. It's not a subject of some ancient mythology or something where maybe you had to be highly educated in order to appreciate the story. It's available to anyone. It's understandable by anyone. And it speaks of your world and your experience. So there seems to be something sort of egalitarian about the idea of landscape imagery broadly, because that's when it always sort of reaches its peak. Now, I said something happens in Japan in the 1850s. And what happens in Japan is us. America shows up in the form of Commodore Perry, who arrived in Tokyo Harbor in 1853, pointed his guns at Tokyo and says, "Want to trade?" And of course, they say, yeah, okay. And from that moment on, everything changes in Japan. It's called gunboat diplomacy is what it was called. And America forces Japan to open up to the West. And Japan is actually pretty lucky on this because they become westernized and open to the West earlier than anywhere else in Asia. And this actually protected them in the 19th century from suffering the kind of colonization that most of the rest of Asia was forced to undergo. It really changed their path. Even though they weren't open to it immediately, nonetheless, it had a huge impact. Westerners had been largely expelled from Japan in the 17th century. So it had been like 150 years or so when they decided to open up. Now, another way it changed Japan is it actually, remember this is a new period. It's called the Meiji period. Remember the previous period, the Tokugawa were in power in the Edo period. He was the shogun. He was the last Tokugawa shogun was the last shogun, because when this happened, America came, it made the shogun look weak. It made them look very weak. And their power rested on their strength. It was all about how powerful they were. But they didn't look that powerful anymore. And it didn't take long before they were out of business. So by 1868, a period called the Meiji period began. And this is when the emperor actually briefly returns to power. The emperor is actually ruling at this time. He doesn't have a warlord ruling for him. It's very different. The Tokugawa were important. They unified Japan, but now the emperor is ruling. I love this print by Sadahide, Foreigners in Yokohama. Yokohama was a very important city. It was a trading city, a shipping city. So it was a very international city. It was the most international city in Japan. And so there were trading districts. There were districts where you had all these people from around the world, from all over Europe and China and other places. And what I love about this is it seems to encapsulate this sort of moment of minds meeting on the street. It's sort of a clash of cultures, but it's not Japanese culture and Western culture. It's an Englishman and a Chinese man, both foreigners in Japan. It's like two foreigners are meeting and looking at each other. There's an element of humor in this as it's being told sort of on the streets of Japan. So again, it's very much a story about life on the streets, but it's really speaking about this clash of cultures that are happening at the time. So it's opened up, right? Everything's opened up. He arrived, Perry arrived in 53. By 84, a college is created, Tokyo College of Fine Arts, to modernize traditional Japanese art. Still in the 1850s, there were strong movements almost immediately to embrace Western styles in art, very, very quickly. But this was a movement coming a little later to try and hold on to traditional arts because they were being lost very quickly to Western styles. This artist, Yokoyama Taikan, is a major heroic figure in the history of Japanese art. He just had, a few years ago, they had a major retrospective of his work. I adore his work. He's a very important artist, trying to hold on to tradition. It's not that he was against Western style. He just wanted to keep some aspects of the Eastern style, particularly water-based paints on silk. He wasn't against Western style, but he didn't want to paint Western style. Let's do oil on canvas. He didn't want to lose the mediums that were traditionally Western style. And so in helping to organize the school and to teach there. He's helping to preserve the sort of indigenous artistic traditions while modernizing them at the same time. The style was known as Nihon Ga. Ga means painting. I think we encountered that before. Dash Ga means painting. So Nihon is actually the name of Japan. In Japanese, the country is called Nihon. So Nihonga is Japanese painting or Japanese style painting. And the Nihonga style is really fascinating. I personally love it, and I'm kind of going through a period where I'm really looking into it and studying it myself now because it's having an impact on my own drawing style. This is a painting by Yokoyama Taikan. I don't have the name of it, but you can see how it is both traditional and modern at the same time. It absorbs all of the things. Of course, the red sun in the back is a reference to the country itself, Nihon. Nihon is the name of Japan, but it also means rising sun. And so we've got the sun here, but the detail on the tree, the tree is interesting paradox. The trunk of the tree, it seems much more detailed and naturalistic than anything we've seen in Japanese art before. But at the same time, the sort of leaves are all about pattern. It's not about the detail of the leaves or where they are in relation to one another. It's not realism. It's flat patterning, just like we saw in the color woodblock prints. It's like you have a stamp or a pattern for those leaves, and then it's repeated. So it's a mixture of styles. It's a mixture of patterning, repetition, and with some detail. And I think this is absolutely beautiful piece, as is this, which is also Nihonga style. And it also merges aspects of the modern and the traditional, but using water-based paints to kind of merge these various styles. Absolutely love his work. Now, opposite him, his opposite in a way, was Kuroda Sakai, who was very, very popular at the time. But in more modern times, Sakai has become kind of the evil force in Japan. After World War II in particular, he wasn't seen as positively because he's the one as early as 1855, and that's what, two years after the Americans arrived, he formed the Institute for the Study of Western Books. And those were primarily art books. What he meant was study these art books and paint like they do in Europe. And the yoga style, now this is not yoga. It has nothing to do with what we think of as yoga. It's two words, yoga, and yo means Western, ga means painting. So yoga style is Western painting, and that means everything, embracing the whole thing. Oil on canvas, naturalism, everything like Europe. Remember when we were looking at Chinese art and we saw some of those later sort of early 20th century Chinese artists? Where did they go to study Western art? They went to Japan because they were coming to study with people like Sakai. He had been to Europe. He had studied in Paris. He's now back in Japan, and he's not only teaching Japanese, but this is where the Chinese artists are coming to study European art, because these are the guys who had been there. And then in 1919, he founds the Japan Fine Arts Academy to teach yoga style. So there's this conflict that's going on in Japanese history between these two styles, these two ways of embracing the modern. This, you can't get much more Western. Kuroda Sakai, self-portrait, oil on canvas. There is nothing Asian about it except the man depicted in the image. Everything else is purely a Western style. I love it. It's a wonderful self-portrait. I think it's a beautiful painting of him clearly as a young man. He's wearing his French beret. I love that. He's wearing European clothes. He may very well have been in Europe when he painted this. I'm not sure. No, I don't think he'd been to Europe yet, but I don't want to swear to that. Anyway, totally a European, something like this. doesn't really seem to fit well with me. There's something odd about this painting. Lake Shore from 97, oil on canvas. It's a Japanese subject, but everything else about it is not at all. But it's people like this. Now, as we move into the 20th century, we're getting other people absorbing these sort of Western and Eastern styles. This work, the Kobayashi, Kokai, fruit. This is a hand scroll, paint on paper. So this is traditional materials. But now what we're seeing in this period is Japanese artists going to Europe, Europeans being influenced by Japanese prints, Japanese artists coming back and painting in a European style, then European painters embracing what the Japanese did. It's this complete cultural merging that's happening in the late 19th century. And when we see people like Paul Cézanne, you could see it in the context of the direction of Western art, but you can't separate it from the impact of Japanese art on the West at the time. The black outlines around the figures, the absence of a horizon line, which is typical Yamato A style. You don't get a horizon line, it's all tilted up. So you're looking at multiple points of view here. All of this is leading into, modernism as we know it today. The most famous artist in Europe at the time, interacting with European artists, is Fujita Sugihara. And he's the only one I'm really familiar with from a Western tradition. He was known as Fujisan in Paris. And he arrived there in 1913, which is this period of the early 20th century is the area that I've studied a great deal of. He was part of the circle that included people like Modigliani and Picasso and early Matisse, and he's sort of in that circle. You encounter him when you study Western art. You don't have to study Japanese art. He was a real character. He named himself Leonardo. I mean, that's not his name, but he started using that name when he went to Europe. He was a rather flamboyant character in many ways. He wrote one of his big books is on cats. It's all images on cats, and there are these wonderful cat images. This is one of Fujisan's. I can't help but think of him as anything but Fujisan. One of his images in a Western style, and this is one of his paintings. He's totally embracing the Western tradition, but he's very influenced by people like Modigliani. Modigliani is known for these sort of elongated figures, and he's an Italian who was working in Paris during this period. He's part of that so-called School of Paris that was happening, before and sort of right after the war, World War I. And you can see Fujita's work in that context. Okay, I want to jump to after World War II and just very briefly look at a couple of people. Now, after World War II, Japan is one of the most internationally connected places in the art world. I want to speak to you briefly about a group of artists known as the Gutai group in Japan, working in the 50s on the cutting edge of contemporary art, a cutting edge of international contemporary art. This is Saburo Murakami. There are a bunch of Murakamis as artists, so you always have to be careful who you're talking to. They were one of the very earliest groups working with, really helping to create the medium of conceptual and performance art. 56 is very early in Europe or anywhere else in America. Really, it's America where that begins, not Europe. It's in America. It really arises in America. And there was one early piece from 1952 that hardly anybody knew about. But generally, when we think of conceptual and performance art, we're generally talking about 1960 and after. To have something like this at this time is very early. The name Gutai translates something like embodiment or concreteness. I would say what it means is giving form to an idea or giving physical manifestation to an idea is roughly what Gutai means. And that's a pretty good definition of conceptual and performance art. It's sort of giving form to an idea or a concept. This particular piece called Passing Through is one in which they lined up. These are sort of frames, wooden frames that have paper over them, like a picture frame with paper over it. And then the artist sort of from one end to the other just sort of broke through each sheet one at a time. And it's called Passing Through. And it actually references a lot of things. It speaks to Japanese tradition in art, which was rooted in the paper, as a medium. It speaks to sort of the Western tradition with the wooden frame, which is not an Eastern tradition. It's really referencing a lot of ideas. And at its core, it seems to be a kind of challenge to artistic tradition. And it's about breaking away from a way of doing things, breaking away from a particular tradition. Conceptual and performance art like this, and I'm not going into this because that's really belongs in a different class, but it's about taking your mind to a certain place. It's about making you think about a certain thing. Can they get you to think about something? And in this case, it's about raising questions like, why is he doing this? Why paper? What's that got to do with art? What's the frame got to do with art? Well, we know what those have to do with art. Anyway, the point is, it's very, very early. You know, they did write a manifesto, and one of the things they said was that their goal was to pursue enthusiastically the possibilities of pure creativity. So again, a very good definition of conceptual and performance art. I want to look at two contemporary pieces, and then we're done with Japan. The first one I want to look at is a piece by Yanagi Yukinori, and he does a number of very famous pieces like this. I think this is a very important piece. It's called the Hinomaru Illumination, Amaterasu and Haniwa, and we've already encountered some of these things. You know, when we looked at contemporary Chinese art, we saw several artists who were dealing with political issues. Chinese art tends to be political because it's the politics of China right now that is of interest to artists. You know, what are they allowed to do? Are they allowed to criticize political regimes or political choices? We don't see, when we say Japanese art's political, we don't mean it in the same way. It doesn't necessarily mean current politics. It's political in the sense that political refers to structures of power and how they relate to people. First of all, this is an installation, which is a very common type of contemporary art in which an artist constructs a kind of venue or space for you to experience for a period of time. Installations are generally temporary, although there can be permanent installations. Some museums have permanent installations, but in most cases, they're temporary installations, and they're usually multiple media. So several different kinds of media are used, and they're often placed in such a way that you physically interact with them. Maybe you walk through them, or you share a space with them, and therefore the viewer interacts with them in a very different way than you would interact with, say, a painting hanging on the wall, in which psychologically you are completely separate from that object. Installations, you're not separate from that. It's a shared experience. Now, before I talk about what he's really intending here, we need to talk about the Japanese flag, because that's what this is about. And this is a sort of thing that I wouldn't have to explain to someone from Japan, but we're not, so I will. And the Hinamaru is the contemporary Japanese flag with the red sun in the middle. It actually means circle of sun is really what the word Hinamaru means. Amaterasu is the goddess of the sun, the Shinto goddess of the sun, who I first mentioned on literally the first day we looked at Japanese art. And we also saw the Haniwa, which were those clay figures from very, very early period that were placed around the tomb of an early Japanese emperor. So clearly there are references here, but we need to figure out what those references are. So first of all, let's look at the flag, the tradition of flag in Japan. Before the Tokugawa moved the capital to Edo and the Edo period began, the shogunate, before the country was completely unified, every clan had its own clan flag. There was no national flag because there was no nation. There was a clan flag. And these are just a few of the clan flags. And one of my favorite is the Mitsubishi clan flag, which you clearly recognize is still being used by Mitsubishi on their cars. But I bet you didn't know that was an old flag of the warlords of the Mitsubishi clan. I find that absolutely fascinating. When the Tokugawa emperor, Ieyasu, unified the nation, first of all, when he did that, he didn't do anything immediately. However, in what happens in 1853, the Americans show up and force them to begin trading with the West. And the first thing the shogun recognized is all these ships coming in from these other countries, they're all flying flags. They all have national flags. And so he adopted this flag. It was known at that time as just the unification flag, because their ships had to have a flag. They finally had a unified country, but no national flag. So he took aspects of clan flags and they decided to adopt this. So it symbolized, at that time, it symbolized unification and the nation itself, of course. That was an important part of it. And then they started flying this on the merchant fleets that would sail, would now fly the new flag. And then in 1870, it became, legally became the flag of the nation. It was just, it was used at the time, but now a law was passed in 1870. But that law was rescinded 15 years later, and through most of Japanese history, they didn't have legally a flag. This was the de facto flag, but it wasn't the only flag that was used, nor was it necessarily the legal flag. So its roots are in Shinto because it references the sun and therefore the sun goddess, Amaterasu. So that's sort of where it comes from. In around 1900 or so, around 1900, Japan was at war with Russia. There was a Russo-Japanese war. And at that time, the military began flying what was called the Kyoku Jitsuki flag. That was embraced by the military. And Kyoku Jitsuki means the rising sun. So when you hear about the flag with the rising sun, that is not the flag with the red circle on it. It's the flag with the 16 red bars on it. That's the rising sun. And that was used by the military. But at the same time, the nation was using the one it was using the Hinamaru flag, which was just the round sun or the circle of sun. And there were actually variations of that. As you can see, the one on the left, the circle is not centered, it's off to the left, and the other one, it's centered. The one on the left was used by the Navy, the one on the right was used by the Army. So they even had two variations of that. So that flag early on became associated with the military, while the other was just associated with the nation as a de facto flag. Now, when World War II came, they developed this practice called the Yosagaki. This flag here is the Yosagaki Hinamaru. It's a regular Hinamaru flag, but it has writing on it. They would give every soldier one of these flags. They would give it to the family, and everyone in the family would write messages or prayers or just, good luck or whatever on the flag, and then they would present it to the soldier. So Japanese soldiers would carry these. And many of them have made their way to this country because a lot of American soldiers took them as war booty or whatever. Many of them have been returned since then. But it was at that time where the flag began taking on other associations. It began to be seen as almost having magical powers or properties, like it could protect you. It became more than just a symbol of the nation. It became kind of a personal flag. So each person had their own personal flag that had particular, almost magical meaning for them. Now, after the war, we get a whole different thing. The two military flags, they're sometimes called hiyashi, ignore the terminology, but those flags were banned after World War II because they were, by the West, basically America says those are banned because they were seen as the military flags. And you couldn't fly them. But interestingly, in 1959, the military started flying them again. The Navy started flying that flag. And they, as far as I know, they still do, even though technically they were told they weren't allowed to. In 1999, finally, Japan passes a bill that identifies the new Hinamaru flag as the legal flag of Japan. And what they did was they changed the color. The original flag from Tokugawa was a darker red. They lightened the red. And I know in this image, it appears as if the circle is slightly smaller, but I wouldn't trust that. I don't believe that's necessarily the case, but it is a color difference. They said, well, we're not going to fly the old flag. We're going to create an entirely new flag. So they made it a slightly lighter shade of red. That was the only change that was made. I'm telling you this story because all of this is very controversial in Japan. When the military started flying the rising sun flag again, it was an outrage. People were outraged in Japan that it would lead to militarism again and everything that led to the war. This is a much bigger controversy in Japan than it is most places. But it is controversial. And it actually came up again in 2018. Japan was doing sort of war games with Korea, and their Japanese ship showed up flying one of these rising sun flags, and the Koreans were outraged because to them it was a symbol of aggression and barbarism and all of the horrible things. The Japanese did not treat the Koreans well, and there were many atrocities, and they were outraged, and they said they would not participate in these war games until the Japanese took that flag down, and the Japanese wouldn't take the flag down, and they left and went home. And that was 2018. So these are still very big issues in Japan. So when we come to something like this, that image is charged. Now that big thing you see in the back, that is actually a video screen, and it's a series of images on it. You're just seeing one image now, but it actually rotates a series of images of all the variations of Japanese flags, but it also is interspersed with an image of a black sun, reminiscent of an eclipse, a solar eclipse. It's a sort of a neon screen where the light just vibrates out and shines out over all the figures. And then he's installed these Haniwa figures, which he's reproduced the soldier-like one. So it looks like they're in sort of regimented, and some of them look like they're saluting the flag. I mean, he's doing this very intentionally, the way he's playing them out. So he's creating almost a, is he suggesting, or it looks like he's suggesting, a kind of group mentality? Are they mesmerized by the light of the sun? He's been accused that they've been called sort of obsessive repetition, but they also speak very much of regimentation in other ways that are Japanese, that the Japanese would understand. Consumerism, the role of popular culture as an obsession in Japan. The Japanese would read, and do read, many, many layers of meaning in an installation like this. In fact, he's been really criticized as being very, very harsh and contradictory to the Japanese government and Japanese history. I think it's pretty hard for any of us to see that because it's not our experience, it's not our culture, and we're really not able to understand why it is seen as powerful as it is in Japanese culture. So he's done many large installations like these, dealing with things like nationalism and internationalism, globalization, imperial history comes into all of this, culture and politics deal with all of this. So I wouldn't say most, but I would say one of the most important driving forces in contemporary Japanese art is the issue of identity, of, who are we? What are the icons and symbols that define who we are? And certainly he's using sort of this flag and the changing flag and the controversy of the flag as one way to deal with that. So instead of looking at the current politics, he's looking more at who are we? What is our identity? Who am I? And another, I just want to leave you with, this is actually the same artist we ended with in the Western art course. So if you had that, you may remember Yasumasa Morimura, because he is also an archetypal Japanese artist. This is from '96. Morimura deals very much with identity in Japanese culture, with the Japanese obsession, particularly with American culture, with American celebrity, how, many aspects of Japanese culture are steeped in American culture, particularly American pop culture, in terms of clothes and dress and everything about it. It's really almost to the point of an obsession in some contexts in Japan. And it's a troubling obsession. Like, why are you so, obsessed with absorbing this other culture that isn't yours, and sort of rejecting the West? And so he's sort of enacting or taking on those roles. So, I mean, this is him, by the way. This is Yasumasa Morimura, photographed 3 times as Marilyn Monroe, who certainly stood. I don't know that many people today who would see her as an icon of American culture, but in the 90s, I think there was still a majority of people who would see an image of Marilyn and recognize it as an iconic image of American culture. So again, he's raising questions. Conceptual art like this is about raising questions about, why is he dressed like this? Why Marilyn? But he's Japanese. And so then that takes you down this other path and makes you start thinking about other aspects of Japanese culture. So we've come a long way from early Shinto work into another place entirely, but that was really all that I wanted to talk to you about in the context of Japanese art. So I would very much like to know if anybody has questions, comments at this point.
I have a question.
Yes.
When we were looking at foreigners in Yokohama,
Yeah.
You said there was a Japanese man and a Chinese man and a European man. What is it that identifies him as Chinese as opposed to Japanese?
Oh, clothing is entirely different. This is nothing like the clothing of a Japanese person.
Okay.
Nothing even close. So this is, yeah.
Are there facial features that?
No. Ethnically, I sometimes I think I can tell, but I can't.
Okay.
Ethnically, there's not. They move, they're the same peoples.
Okay.
Although as cultures diverge, sometimes physical characteristics will diverge with them, but that isn't what defines it. It's not his face. It's his hair, his clothes. This is not a long kimono. Chinese wore pants and jackets. Yeah, it's entirely different clothing.
Yeah, and he has that long ponytail
right.
that they were required to wear. So.
Really?
The queue, wasn't it?
The queue, yes, thank you.
Yeah, that queue was what they cut off in America in the anti-Chinese riots in the history books. That was one of the considered punishment.
Right.
In addition to beating them up and burning their houses down.
And other, things like that.
And Peg, the way you can kind of tell the difference between Japanese and Chinese is really how they carry themselves.
Really?
I immediately can tell a Chinese person from a Japanese person. And also there is a little bit of subtlety in their faces too, believe it or not.
Yeah, sometimes I think I can tell, and I don't know how. So maybe I'm picking up on some of those body messages.
Yeah, it's really kind of the whole stature on, it's like the Chinese are a little bit more, they're a little bit more down, or Japanese are kind of more straight up or something. It's hard to, I can see it right now, but it's hard for me to explain.
I could tell too in Seattle, but it's interesting, as late as the 60s when I went to college in Seattle, there no Japanese would go study in the chemistry building, because that's where the Chinese who studied pharmacy had their study hall. And even then it was, I'm talking 64, there was still that animosity there.
Yeah.
Seattle.
Well, someone once said to me, who I assumed was Chinese, and they were offended and said, "Do I look Chinese?" And I really couldn't tell the difference between Chinese and Japanese.
Funnily enough, Peg, I've been told from my Chinese friends, I can't tell you white people apart. You all look the same.
I assume that's what it was. Yes.
Well, there's some difference when if you watch movies, like Asian movies, if somebody runs, then I can tell the difference instantly, because they run differently. And that has to do with clothing, because when Japanese runs in old movies, they take very small, real fast, small steps. And it has to do with the garments, the long robes. You can't just run outright. You run differently if you're wearing a long robe than if you're wearing pants.
Yeah.
And even if you're no longer wearing those garments, you still take smaller steps. It's like it's just a different way of moving.
Yeah.
I know a man from Korea who swears he can tell the difference among each of them. And he does.
Well, I think Asians can. More easily.
Oh, absolutely. I got a big long lecture on how to tell them apart, and I still don't remember all the nuances. And it was a Chinese guy who grew up, he was one of my first lead engineers at Boeing, and he explained to me how you could tell all these ethnic groups or where they were from apart. And I says, oh, okay, well,
Yeah,
But can't you tell? I mean, if I'm in Europe, I can spot an American a mile away. I can spot a Frenchman, a German, Italian. They're
Well-
different. They hold themselves different. It's not just
Yeah.
the clothes.
Yeah.
It's a million different things.
yeah, yeah. Claudine, you have a question.
You're muted. Oh, no, you're not. Go ahead.
My question has to do with the flag and the sun. How do the Japanese do not consider that symbolism as a national flag at all? They're,
No, they do. It's just that they didn't have a law that said this is the flag. They used it as the flag. It was the de facto flag, but at the same time, it just wasn't a legal document that said this is the national flag, which is why somebody could start using this one, because there's no law that says I have to use that one. So we prefer this one. So, at this time, there are multiple, it just sort of, without making it a law, the military, it was just decided, okay, the military is going to use this one, but we're going to use this one.
so some people, though, what I heard you say sort of was some people thought that symbolism was warlike.
Yeah, oh yeah. This one was because it's military. And also because of World War II. I mean, this is, soldiers, certainly in the West, this is what they saw as the Japanese flag, the flag of the rising sun. This was what the ships flew. And so, Americans certainly would see this as the flag they saw every day, but they also saw the other one because the ground forces, they were all carrying one of these that had writing all over it. So, soldiers in the war would have seen both of these depending on where you were fighting. And so after the war, we talked in the Western course, we talked a lot about when we got there, we talked about what happened in Germany after the war and how, the generation after the war wanted to talk about the war and they wanted information, and they banned the swastika. There were people after World War II that were arguing that the rising sun flag was equivalent to the swastika flag and that it should be legally banned. And they tried doing that, but like I said, it only lasted maybe 10 years before the military said, no, this is our flag and we want to use it. So it depends who you are. To some people, this is going to look like the swastika flag. To other people, it's not.
Oh, well, it looks, as I recall, it was used during World War I even.
Well, yeah, you're right. They began using it when they were fighting Russia around 1900. That's when this first began to be used by the military. And it was continuously used by the military through the 20th century up until the end of World War II. So you're right. This was used by the military. But the other one, this one was still being used in a non-military context.
Which one?
The one with just the single sun. The circle of sun, as it's called. This was always recognized, if not legally, this was used as the national flag, or this was used as the military flag.
Oh, okay.
They separated them. And that's kind of where we still are today, because the Navy's still flying this, I'm told, although I haven't checked. That's why this work comes about, because of the conflict and the controversies around the flags and what they symbolize and what they mean as it relates to Japanese militarism and the like. So it's a work of art that makes us think about and talk about these things. I mean, we're talking about it now. I mean, you can imagine in Japan how people would be talking about this work. It would get some people riled up, and that's kind of the idea. Any other questions or comments about anything at all?
Oh, those soldiers or those images in that picture remind me of the ones they dug up.
Yep, that's what they are. These are haniwa. These are haniwa. Remember the haniwa? Haniwa means clay cylinder, and these are exactly those. In fact, I mean, he's intentionally referencing Amaterasu and the Haniwa. So that's what they are. They're figures. I mean, these aren't the real ones from the grave. These are, copies, but they're identical to the ones that were found on that emperor's around the hill, above that emperor's grave. So in using them, he's also referencing the sun, the goddess Amaterasu. He's referencing the imperial system. He's referencing all sorts of things. That's why art is what it is. One little image you put two little images together or three little ideas together, and you've referenced like an encyclopedia of ideas. I mean, when you start combining things, you're creating layers of meanings and making people address or think about ideas. You could write a big long essay. I don't think that would have the impact of a single visual image like this. I mean, that's what they say, right? A picture's worth 1,000 words. That's basically the idea. So he's chosen these things very intentionally and very carefully to not answer a question, but to ask a question. These are open-ended ideas for you to think about. He's not telling you, here's what we should do, or here's what should happen. Anything else?
Well, we're seeing this on a computer that's fairly small.
Yeah.
The photograph of that is small. What is the actual size of those what do you call them? The Hanway?
Haniwa,
What were the actual size in the
This is the size they were. These are the actual size those figures were. They look just like this.
But we can't tell by this little piece.
Well,
What's
they're
the height?
about
Three
three, yeah,
3 or
about
4
3
feet.
yeah, 3 to 4 feet. 3 to 4 feet is about right. And he's actually duplicating a lot of the same ones. I mean, a lot of these are there are identical and they're duplicates, and there weren't really that many identical or duplicates on the actual tomb. He's chosen the ones that look like soldiers and then reproduced them a bunch of times. He's not trying to show you, because if you remember, they were all sorts of things. Some were houses and birds, and they weren't all soldiers. He's just
So if those soldiers are 4 feet tall, then there's all the rest. There's all the rest of that space overhead. So it's a huge painting, correct?
This is not a painting. This is not a painting. This is not a painting. They're actually sitting there. You're looking inside of an art gallery. This is a room in an art gallery, and there's a screen in the front. And these are figures. These are clay figures sitting on the floor in front of that screen.
It's a large installation piece.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love installation. It's one of my favorite media because it engages all of your senses, and that's the whole point, is that, it really pulls you in and engages you. But no, this is a real space that we're looking at. So he's using sculpture here. He's using video on the screen. So yeah, sorry, I should have explained that more clearly. It's really a multimedia installation is what it really is.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Lots of fun.
You've been wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you.
Sure has.